Hidden behind the towering wall of mountains that runs through the Pacific Northwest, the Cascade Range, are entire towns that experience something completely different. They sit inside something called a rain shadow. Moist air from the Pacific Ocean hits the mountains, rises, cools, and dumps most of its rain on the western side. By the time that air crosses the peaks and descends into the valleys on the other side, it's basically dry. The result? Places in the Pacific Northwest that feel almost like a completely different climate. Blue skies, dry summers, winters that are cold but not constantly soaked. Some of these towns receive half the rainfall of Seattle, or even less. Which explains why people who love the mountains, forests, and scenery of the Pacific Northwest, but absolutely hate living inside a permanent car wash, are quietly moving to these spots. In this video, we are counting down 7 rain shadow towns in the Pacific Northwest where it hardly ever rains, at least by regional standards. Some are quiet desert edge communities tucked against canyon walls. Some are growing outdoor hubs where hiking trails and breweries now outnumber gas stations. And one of them has become a magnet for people fleeing Seattle's gray winters entirely. But before we get started, a quick favor. If you like honest breakdowns of towns, cities, and hidden corners of the United States, the good, the weird, and the occasionally questionable, make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because we have got a lot more places coming that might completely change where you think about living. Alright, let's start the countdown. Number 7. Ellensburg, Washington. Ellensburg is one of those towns that feels like it accidentally landed in the wrong state. You drive over the Cascade Mountains from Seattle, through dense forests, wet pavement, and fog hanging in the trees, and then suddenly the sky opens up. The air dries out, the hills turn golden, and the rain almost completely disappears. Welcome to the rain shadow. Ellensburg sits in central Washington, about halfway between Seattle and Spokane. The town has a population of roughly 19,000 people, and it is tucked into the Kittitas Valley, surrounded by rolling hills that look more like inland California than the classic mossy Pacific Northwest. Geographically, Ellensburg sits directly east of Snoqualmie Pass, one of the main breaks in the Cascade Range, and that location changes everything. When moist Pacific air hits the Cascades, it unloads most of its precipitation on the western slopes, places like Seattle, Tacoma, and the Olympic Peninsula. By the time that air crosses the mountains and drops into the Kittitas Valley, it has already lost most of its moisture. Seattle receives around 38 inches of rain per year. Ellensburg receives closer to 9 inches. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between constant drizzle and something closer to high desert weather. The climate here is defined more by sun and wind than by rain. Summers are warm, dry, and bright. Temperatures regularly climb into the 80s and 90s, but the lack of humidity keeps the heat manageable. Winters are colder than the western side of the mountains. Snow is common, but they are usually clear and crisp rather than wet and gray. And then there is the wind. Ellensburg sits in a natural funnel between mountain ranges, which means the valley can get very windy, especially during seasonal transitions. Some days the gusts sweep across the valley like someone turned on a giant fan. Locals are used to it. Visitors usually comment on it within about 10 minutes. Economically, Ellensburg is anchored by Central Washington University, which brings students, events, and a steady flow of academic energy into what would otherwise be a small agricultural town. Beyond the university, the surrounding region is deeply tied to farming and ranching. The valley produces hay, cattle, and some specialty crops, and agriculture still plays a big role in the local economy. But over the last decade, Ellensburg has quietly become something else too. An outdoor hub. The Yakima River runs nearby, offering fly fishing and rafting. Trails climb into the surrounding hills for hiking and mountain biking. And the Cascade Mountains, with their forests, alpine lakes, and ski areas, are only about 40 minutes away. It creates a strange but appealing mix. Small college town, high desert climate, mountain recreation on the doorstep. Downtown Ellensburg also has a surprisingly preserved historic core. Brick buildings from the late 1800s still line the streets, housing coffee shops, bookstores, breweries, and restaurants that give the town a livelier feel than its population might suggest. But life here moves at a slower pace. Big shopping trips usually mean driving to Yakima, about 35 miles away. The nearest major airport is over an hour away in the Tri-Cities or Seattle, and job opportunities outside the university and agriculture can be limited. Still, for people leaving the rainier parts of the Pacific Northwest, Ellensburg offers something that feels almost shocking: sunlight. Lots of it. It is a place where you can still live in the Pacific Northwest and enjoy the mountains, rivers, and forests that make the region famous, but without waking up every morning to the sound of drizzle tapping on the windows. And for a surprising number of people, that alone makes Ellensburg worth a serious look. Next up, a town where the rain shadow effect becomes even more dramatic, and where the landscape starts to feel almost like the American Southwest, despite being deep in the Pacific Northwest. Number 6, Wenatchee, Washington. If you follow the Columbia River east from the Cascade Mountains, the landscape changes fast. The forests thin out, the sky opens wide, and the rain that defines so much of the Pacific Northwest suddenly becomes surprisingly rare. That shift is exactly where Wenatchee sits. With a population of roughly 35,000 people, Wenatchee lies in central Washington, tucked between the eastern slopes of the Cascade Range and the wide Columbia River Valley. The town sits at the meeting point of two rivers, the Columbia River and the Wenatchee River, creating a geographic crossroads that has shaped the region for more than a century. But the real story here is not just the rivers, it is the mountains behind them. Wenatchee sits squarely inside the Cascade Range shadow, where Pacific moisture loses most of its water before it ever reaches the valley floor. While Seattle averages around 38 inches of rain per year, Wenatchee receives closer to 11 inches annually. That is less rainfall than many cities in the Midwest, and the difference is immediately noticeable. Summers here are bright, dry, and warm, often climbing into the 80s and 90s with long stretches of blue sky that can last for weeks. Winters bring colder temperatures and occasional snow, but they are typically crisp rather than constantly wet. Instead of the dripping evergreen forests people associate with the Pacific Northwest, Wenatchee sits in a landscape of rolling hills, orchards, and dry grasslands. And those orchards are the backbone of the local economy. The Wenatchee Valley is often called the apple capital of the world. Miles of apple trees stretch across the surrounding countryside, along with cherries, pears, and other fruit crops that thrive in the region's sunny climate and fertile soil. Agriculture remains one of the largest industries in the area, supported by food processing facilities, distribution centers, and seasonal farm labor. But Wenatchee has also grown beyond farming. Its position along the Columbia River and several major highways has turned it into a regional hub for north-central Washington. Healthcare, logistics, retail, and outdoor tourism now play a much larger role in the local economy than they did decades ago. The surrounding geography also makes the area unusually appealing for outdoor recreation. Within an hour's drive, residents can reach alpine lakes, hiking trails, ski resorts, and river rafting routes in the Cascades. In the other direction, the Columbia Basin opens into wide desert landscapes and canyon country that feels dramatically different from the wetter western side of the state. It is this combination that draws people in: mountain access, river views, and far more sunshine than most of the Pacific Northwest. Downtown Wenatchee reflects its role as a regional center. Cafes, restaurants, and small shops line the historic streets, while newer developments stretch along the riverfront with parks and walking trails overlooking the Columbia. Life here is still quieter than in Washington's larger cities. Seattle is about 3 hours away by car, which means big city amenities require some planning. But for many residents, that distance is a fair trade. Because Wenatchee offers something increasingly rare in the Pacific Northwest, a place where you can enjoy the mountains, rivers, and outdoor lifestyle the region is famous for, without living under constant rain clouds. The next ones will get even drier and more dramatic geographically, and some of them drop to 7 to 8 inches of rain per year. Number 5. Yakima, Washington. Yakima is where the Pacific Northwest starts to feel like it quietly changed climates without telling anyone. Drive west from Seattle through the Cascades, and the shift happens almost suddenly. The forests thin out, the moss disappears, and the endless gray skies that define the western side of Washington give way to something far brighter. Yakima sits right in the middle of that transformation. With a population of about 96,000 residents, Yakima is one of the larger cities in central Washington, located in the wide Yakima Valley roughly 140 miles southeast of Seattle. The city lies east of the Cascade Range, tucked into a broad basin surrounded by low hills and agricultural land that stretches for miles in every direction. And because of the mountains to the west, Yakima sits firmly inside the Cascade rain shadow. When moisture from the Pacific Ocean reaches the Cascades, it releases most of its rain on the western slopes, places like Seattle and Tacoma. But once that air crosses the mountains and descends into the Yakima Valley, it has already lost most of its moisture. The numbers make the contrast clear. Seattle averages about 38 inches of rainfall each year. Yakima receives roughly 8 inches annually. That is closer to the rainfall totals of cities in Nevada or eastern Oregon than it is to the famously wet coastal Pacific Northwest. The result is a climate that feels much more like high desert than rainforest. Summers are hot and dry, often pushing into the 90s, with long stretches of cloudless skies. Winters are cooler and occasionally snowy, but they tend to be crisp and dry rather than damp and gray. And that dry, sunny weather has turned the Yakima Valley into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the country. Yakima is especially famous for one crop, hops. The valley produces roughly 75% of the hops grown in the United States, supplying breweries across the country. If you have ever had an American craft beer, there is a good chance the hops started life somewhere in the fields surrounding Yakima. But hops are just part of the story. The valley is also known for apples, cherries, wine grapes, and other fruit crops supported by irrigation systems that channel water from the nearby mountains into the otherwise dry landscape. Economically, Yakima functions as the commercial center of the valley with hospitals, distribution centers, food processing plants, and regional retail drawing people from surrounding towns. Daily life here moves at a noticeably slower pace than the major cities west of the Cascades. Traffic is manageable, neighborhoods are spread out, and many residents still have direct ties to the agricultural economy that surrounds the city. At the same time, Yakima has been slowly building a stronger food and beverage culture of its own. Breweries, wineries, and farm-to-table restaurants now take advantage of the valley's agricultural reputation. Outdoor recreation also sits just outside the city limits. Within an hour's drive, residents can reach mountain trails, rivers for rafting and fishing, and winter ski areas in the Cascades. In the opposite direction, the landscape opens into wide desert basins and dramatic canyon country. But the most noticeable difference for many newcomers is still the weather. For people used to the constant drizzle of western Washington, Yakima's climate can feel almost shocking. Bright skies, dry air, and sunshine that shows up far more often than people expect from a place still firmly inside the Pacific Northwest. Number 4, the Dalles, Oregon. The Dalles sits at a geographic crossroads where the Pacific Northwest quietly changes character. If you follow the Columbia River east from Portland, the journey begins in thick forests, damp hillsides, and the kind of steady drizzle the region is famous for. But somewhere along the way, the scenery begins to shift. The trees thin out, the cliffs grow taller, the air dries. By the time you reach the Dalles, the Pacific Northwest suddenly looks very different. The city sits on the southern bank of the Columbia River in north-central Oregon, about 85 miles east of Portland, with a population of roughly 16,000 residents. It is surrounded by rugged canyon walls, dry hills, and sweeping views of the Columbia Gorge that feel far more like inland desert country than coastal rainforest. And that dramatic shift is once again the work of the Cascade rain shadow. Moist air from the Pacific Ocean rises as it climbs over the Cascades, releasing most of its rainfall on the western side of the mountains. By the time that air descends into the Columbia River Gorge east of the peaks, it has already lost much of its moisture. Portland averages around 43 inches of rain each year. The Dalles receives closer to 13 inches annually. That is a huge difference, and it creates a climate that feels much brighter and drier than most of the Pacific Northwest. Summers in the Dalles are hot and sunny, with temperatures frequently reaching the 80s and 90s, and skies that can stay clear for weeks at a time. Winters are cooler, occasionally bringing snow, but they are typically far less wet than the western side of the Cascades. Wind is another defining feature here. The Columbia River Gorge acts like a natural wind tunnel between the Pacific coast and the inland basins of the Northwest. Strong gusts regularly sweep through the valley, which is why the region has become one of the most famous windsurfing and kiteboarding destinations in the United States. On many summer afternoons, the river fills with bright sails and kites skimming across the water, while spectators line the riverfront parks to watch. Historically, the Dalles was one of the most important transportation hubs in the early Pacific Northwest. During the Oregon Trail era, pioneers traveling west often passed through the area before continuing toward the Willamette Valley. Later, railroads and river shipping helped establish the town as a key commercial center along the Columbia. Today, agriculture still plays a major role in the local economy. The surrounding hills produce cherries, wheat, and wine grapes, all supported by irrigation from the Columbia River. The region's dry climate and sunny summers make it particularly well suited for fruit growing. In recent years, the city has also attracted attention for a very different reason. Just outside town sits one of Google's large data centers, drawn to the area by its cool river water for cooling servers and access to inexpensive hydroelectric power from the Columbia River dams. Despite those modern developments, life in the Dalles still feels relaxed and small town. Downtown streets are lined with historic brick buildings, family-owned restaurants, and local shops. Riverfront parks stretch along the Columbia, offering walking paths and open views of the surrounding cliffs. And above all, there is the weather. Compared to the gray skies of western Oregon, the Dalles offers something many people moving to the Pacific Northwest never expected to find: a place where the rain clouds often stop at the mountains, and the sunshine keeps going east. Number 3, Bend, Oregon. Bend is probably the most famous example of the Pacific Northwest's rain shadow effect in action. If you start on the western side of Oregon, in places like Portland or Eugene, the climate feels exactly like the stereotype: gray skies, steady drizzle, and forests so green they almost look unreal. Cross the Cascade Mountains, and the environment changes almost immediately. The forests thin out, the air becomes noticeably drier, and the sunlight suddenly becomes a much more regular part of daily life. That transition is exactly where Bend sits. Located in central Oregon, Bend has grown rapidly over the past 2 decades and now has a population of roughly 105,000 residents. The city lies along the Deschutes River, surrounded by wide-open high desert landscapes, with the snow-covered peaks of the Cascade Range rising dramatically to the west. Those mountains are the key to Bend's climate. Moist air coming off the Pacific Ocean drops most of its rainfall on the western slopes of the Cascades. By the time the air passes over the mountains and descends toward Bend, it has already lost much of its moisture. Portland averages around 43 inches of rain each year. Bend receives closer to 12 inches annually. That difference creates a climate that feels far sunnier and drier than the rest of western Oregon. In fact, Bend averages around 260 days of sunshine each year, which is significantly more than most cities in the Pacific Northwest. Summers are warm, dry, and bright, with temperatures often reaching the 80s and occasionally the 90s. Humidity stays low and clear skies can stretch across the region for weeks at a time. Winters are colder than on the western side of the Cascades, but they bring a different kind of weather. Instead of endless rain, Bend typically sees snow and clear winter days, especially when cold air settles across the high desert. That combination of sun, mountains, and open space has helped turn Bend into one of the fastest-growing outdoor recreation hubs in the region. The nearby Cascade Peaks offer skiing and snowboarding at Mount Bachelor, one of the largest ski resorts in the Pacific Northwest. In the warmer months, hiking, mountain biking, rock climbing, and paddleboarding along the Deschutes River attract thousands of visitors and new residents each year. Economically, Bend has gradually transitioned from a timber town into a city centered on tourism, outdoor recreation, healthcare, and technology. Breweries and restaurants now fill much of the downtown district, and the city has gained a reputation for its vibrant craft beer scene. At the same time, Bend still maintains strong connections to the landscape surrounding it. Wide open high desert plains stretch east toward the Columbia Basin, while alpine lakes and volcanic peaks rise just a short drive west into the Cascades. Daily life in Bend often revolves around the outdoors. Morning trail runs, weekend ski trips, evening walks along the Deschutes River as the sun drops behind the mountains. But the biggest surprise for many newcomers is still the weather. For people who move here expecting the classic rainy Pacific Northwest, Bend can feel almost like a different region entirely. The mountains are still there, the forests are still nearby, but thanks to the Cascade rain shadow, the skies above Bend stay clear far more often than people expect. If Bend represents the booming outdoor hub of Central Oregon, Redmond is the quieter neighbor that sits just a little farther into the rain shadow, and in many ways even deeper into the region's dry-eyed desert climate. Redmond is located about 17 miles north of Bend in Deschutes County, with a population of roughly 35,000 residents. The city lies on a broad plateau overlooking the Deschutes River Canyon, surrounded by wide open plains and volcanic rock formations that stretch across much of Central Oregon. And just like Bend, the climate here is shaped by one dominant geographic feature: the Cascade Mountains. Moist air moving inland from the Pacific Ocean hits the Cascades and releases the majority of its rain on the western slopes. By the time those air masses cross the mountain range and descend into Central Oregon, they have already lost much of their moisture. The result is a classic rain-shadow climate. Portland averages about 43 inches of rainfall each year. Redmond receives closer to 8 to 9 inches annually. That is an enormous difference, and it gives Redmond a climate that feels much closer to high desert than the stereotypical rainy Pacific Northwest. Summers are long, sunny, and dry. Daytime temperatures often reach the mid-80s and 90s, but the dry air keeps the heat more comfortable than it might be in more humid parts of the country. Evenings cool down quickly once the sun drops behind the Cascades, creating the kind of crisp desert nights that residents grow used to. Winters are colder than the western side of Oregon, but they tend to be clearer as well. Snow does fall periodically, but the region experiences many bright winter days where the sun reflects off the surrounding hills and distant mountain peaks. One of the most striking things about Redmond is how open the landscape feels. Instead of dense evergreen forests, the area is dominated by sagebrush, juniper trees, lava rock, and wide rolling plains. On clear days, the western horizon is framed by a dramatic lineup of volcanic peaks: Mount Jefferson, Three-Fingered Jack, and the Three Sisters rising above the Cascade skyline. Economically, Redmond has grown steadily over the past 2 decades as part of the broader Central Oregon expansion. The city is home to Roberts Field, the main commercial airport serving the Bend-Redmond area, which has helped strengthen connections to larger cities across the western United States. Aviation, manufacturing, construction, and regional services now form a significant part of the local economy. Agriculture also plays a role in the surrounding countryside, though much of it relies on irrigation due to the region's naturally dry climate. While Bend often gets the spotlight for its outdoor recreation culture, Redmond offers access to the exact same landscapes. Within an hour's drive, residents can reach ski slopes, alpine lakes, volcanic hiking trails, and long stretches of desert canyon country. At the same time, housing has historically been somewhat more affordable than Bend, which has attracted families and workers looking to stay in the region without paying the city's rising home prices. Daily life in Redmond feels relaxed and practical. Neighborhoods spread out across the plateau. Traffic is minimal. And the skyline remains dominated not by high-rise buildings, but by distant mountain peaks. But the most noticeable difference for people arriving from the western side of the Pacific Northwest is still the weather. Because here, deep in the Cascade rain shadow, the sky is often clear, and the famous Pacific Northwest drizzle rarely makes the trip over the mountains. Number 1. Kennewick, Washington. If you want to see the Pacific Northwest's rain shadow pushed almost to its extreme, you eventually end up in the Tri-Cities region of southeastern Washington. And right in the center of it sits Kennewick. Kennewick is part of a 3-city cluster along the Columbia River that includes Richland and Pasco, forming one of the largest urban areas in eastern Washington. Kennewick itself has a population of roughly 85,000 residents, and together the Tri-Cities region approaches 300,000 people. Geographically, the city sits in the Columbia Basin, far to the east of the Cascade Mountains, and deep within the region's rain shadow. By the time Pacific weather systems reach this part of Washington, they have already crossed multiple mountain barriers. Most of the moisture was dropped long before the air ever reaches the basin. The numbers reflect that dramatic shift. Seattle receives around 38 inches of rain each year. Kennewick averages roughly 7 inches annually. That is not just drier than the western Pacific Northwest, it is comparable to parts of the interior Southwest. The landscape here reflects that dryness. Instead of evergreen forests, the terrain surrounding Kennewick is defined by rolling sagebrush hills, wide open plains, and dramatic basalt cliffs carved by ancient floods thousands of years ago. The Columbia River cuts through the region like a wide blue ribbon, providing water that makes life possible in what would otherwise be a semi-arid environment. Summers here are hot and bright, with temperatures frequently climbing into the 90s and sometimes past 100 degrees during peak heat waves. But the dry air keeps the climate from feeling humid or oppressive in the way that hotter regions sometimes do. Winters are cool and relatively short, occasionally bringing light snow but more often delivering cold, clear days with wide open skies. That combination of sunshine and river access has helped the Tri-Cities develop a strong agricultural economy. The surrounding region produces wine grapes, apples, cherries, wheat, and other crops, supported by irrigation systems drawing water from the Columbia and Snake Rivers. In fact, southeastern Washington has quietly become one of the fastest-growing wine regions in the United States. But agriculture is not the only economic engine here. Kennewick and its neighboring cities are also closely tied to the nearby Hanford site, a massive federal research and nuclear cleanup facility that has shaped the local economy for decades. Engineering, environmental science, government contracting, and energy research all provide jobs throughout the region. Despite its growth, Kennewick still feels far removed from the dense urban corridors of western Washington. Neighborhoods spread out along the riverbanks, traffic remains manageable, and the horizon stretches wide across open desert hills. For people used to the damp climate west of the Cascades, the biggest adjustment is often the weather. Here, blue skies dominate most of the year. Rainstorms are rare, gray weeks are uncommon, and sunshine shows up far more often than the Pacific Northwest's reputation might suggest, which makes Kennewick a fitting final entry on this list. If you are looking for a place in the Pacific Northwest where the mountains, rivers, and scenery still feel unmistakably regional, but the rain almost disappears entirely, this part of Washington might be as close as it gets. The Pacific Northwest has one of the most misunderstood climates in the United States. For many people, the entire region is imagined as a single endless stretch of drizzle, gray skies, wet streets, and forests dripping with rain for most of the year. And to be fair, the western side of the region does live up to that reputation. But the mountains change everything. The Cascade Range and Olympic Mountains act like enormous climate barriers, squeezing moisture out of Pacific storms before they ever reach the landscapes on the other side. What's left behind is a completely different version of the Pacific Northwest. High desert valleys, sunny river basins, wide open skies that feel far removed from the fog and drizzle of the coast. Places like Ellensburg, Wenatchee, Yakima, Bend, Redmond, the Dalles, and Kennewick all exist within that rain shadow, each offering a version of the region where the scenery stays spectacular, but the rain becomes far less of a daily presence. Of course, every one of these towns comes with trade-offs. Some are smaller and quieter than the major coastal cities. Some sit farther from large airports or job markets. And the dry climate can bring its own challenges, from wildfire seasons to colder winter nights. But for people who love the mountains, rivers, and landscapes of the Pacific Northwest, yet prefer sunshine over constant drizzle, these rain shadow towns offer something that feels almost unexpected. A different side of the region entirely, and sometimes all it takes to find it is driving to the other side of the mountains. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video and subscribe, because we've got plenty more lists coming, from overlooked towns and surprising retirement spots to hidden corners of the country most people never think about. And who knows? One of those places might end up being somewhere you never expected to consider calling home.